Hey guys, tonight we're going back, way, way back, to a city built on 7 hills, watered by 11 aqueducts, paved by soldiers who doubled as road engineers, and heated from underneath the floor. Tonight, we are going to ancient Rome. Not the Rome of gladiators and dramatic Senate speeches. Not the Rome of togas and betrayal and dramatic poison. Well, maybe a little of the toga part. But mostly, tonight, we're going to the quieter Rome. The Rome that solved problems. The Rome that looked at a swamp and said, drain it. That looked at a dark room and said, window. That looked at a world full of people dying from bad water and said, pipe it. Tonight's subject is simple ancient Roman inventions that save humanity. And I want you to sit with that word, simple, because the things we're going to talk about tonight are not glamorous. They're not the stuff of epic poetry. No bard ever wrote a ballad about an underground heating pipe. No marble statue was erected in honor of a sewer. And yet, and this is the quiet miracle at the heart of tonight's journey, these modest, practical, often unglamorous inventions reach forward through 2,000 years of history and arrange themselves, invisibly, inside the structure of the world you live in right now. The road you drove on today has Roman DNA. The calendar on your phone? Roman. The book in your hand, or on your nightstand, with its flat pages and its spine? You can thank a Roman scribe for that. We tend to think of ancient history as something distant, something that happened to other people in other climates under stranger skies. But Rome is not distant. Rome is the underground layer of the present. Archaeologists in London keep finding it beneath the city's foundations. Engineers in modern Turkey keep building water systems along the same routes the Romans surveyed 2 millennia ago. And every time someone pours concrete, somewhere in the chemical memory of that mixture, there's a ghost of Roman engineering. So before we go any further, and before your eyes get that soft, heavy, drifting quality that means tonight is working, let me invite you to get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Adjust the pillow. Let your shoulders drop. This is a safe space, a slow space, a space where history doesn't shout at you. It whispers. Support if you'd like, subscribe, or just drift off with me tonight. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your location and local time. There's something genuinely lovely about knowing that someone in Auckland and someone in Oslo and someone in a small town in the American Midwest are all falling asleep to the same story at the same moment. History has always been a shared dream that way. Now, a little context before we dim the lamps entirely. Rome, at its height, was a city of perhaps 1 million people, possibly more. Historians still debate the exact numbers, and they probably always will, because Roman census records were famously inconsistent and occasionally political. But 1 million is the number that most scholars return to, and 1 million people in the ancient world was extraordinary. Staggering even. No other city in the Western world would reach that size again for over 1,000 years after Rome's fall. And feeding, watering, housing, and keeping alive 1 million people in a city without refrigeration, without germ theory, without antibiotics, without modern plumbing, that required invention. Not elegant invention, necessarily. Not invention driven by curiosity or philosophy. Practical invention. Desperate invention, sometimes. The kind of invention that happens when a city gets big enough that the old ways stop working and someone has to sit down and think very hard about pipes. The Romans were not dreamers as a culture. They were builders, administrators, pragmatists. They looked at Greek science and said, yes, but what can we do with it? They looked at problems, disease, distance, darkness, cold, and they built solutions. And those solutions were so well-engineered, so thoughtfully constructed, that many of them are still functioning today. There's an aqueduct bridge in southern France, the Pont du Gard, that has been standing for 2,000 years without mortar holding its upper stones together. Just gravity and geometry. Just Romans being Romans. There are Roman roads in England that stayed in use until the 20th century. There is Roman concrete at the bottom of the Mediterranean that is by some measures stronger than the day it was poured. We will get to all of it. We will move slowly through each invention tonight, the way water moves through an aqueduct, steadily, unhurried, following the gentle slope of the story downhill towards sleep. And by the time we reach the end of tonight's journey, I hope you will feel what I feel when I think about Rome at its quietest and most useful, a kind of gratitude, a soft amazement, a sense that the past is not behind us but beneath us, holding us up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are thirsty. It is a simple fact of being alive, the oldest fact, really. Before Rome had roads or courts or marble temples, before it had senators or emperors or an opinion about architecture, it had thirst. And for a long time, it managed that thirst the same way every other ancient settlement did. It drank from the river. The Tiber River ran through Rome the way a spine runs through a body, central, essential, non-negotiable. Early Romans drank from it, washed in it, probably made quiet prayers beside it at dusk. And for a small village on a set of muddy hills, that was fine. But Rome did not stay a small village. Rome grew, and as it grew, the Tiber became something complicated. The same river that people drank from was also the river that received the city's waste. The same water that filled a mother's cooking pot also carried disease downstream from the tanneries, the slaughterhouses, the neighborhoods too poor to have any other drainage at all. Rome had a water problem, a serious one, and so, in 312 BCE, a Roman censor named Appius Claudius Caecus did something that would change the city, and eventually the world, forever. He built a pipe. Well, not just a pipe. The Aqua Appia, Rome's first aqueduct, was a mostly underground channel stretching roughly 16 kilometers from a spring in the Anio Hills to a distribution point in the city. It moved clean water, spring water, cold and clear, over hills and under fields, defying geography through the elegant application of gravity and engineering, delivering something that had previously required a bucket and a walk to a river that, increasingly, you did not want to drink from. It was, in the most literal sense, water from nowhere. Water that appeared, seemingly by magic, at fountains throughout the city. Water that arrived already cleaned by its long journey through the earth. Water that did not know what a slaughterhouse was. And Romans, practical, always practical, did not stop at one. Over the next 5 centuries, they built 11 aqueducts into the city of Rome. 11. By the height of the empire, this network was delivering somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion liters of fresh water into the city every single day. Let that number settle for a moment. 1 billion liters per day into a city of 1 million people. That is more water per person per day than many modern cities deliver now. The aqueducts fed the city's famous public baths, the thermae, which were not just places to wash, but genuine social institutions. Places where a senator and a baker might sit in the same heated pool and argue about chariot racing. They fed the public fountains, the Nasoni, the stone troughs where animals drank and travelers stopped to cup water in their hands. They fed the homes of the wealthy, who paid for private connections the way we might pay for a broadband subscription. And they fed, critically, the city's basic public health. Because here is what clean water actually does, in practical terms. It stops dysentery. It stops cholera. It stops typhoid. It stops the long, quiet, invisible war that contaminated water wages against the population. The war that, for most of human history, killed more people than any army ever did. Rome, with its aqueducts, was fighting that war before it even had a name for the enemy. Historians still debate whether Roman officials understood germ theory in any meaningful sense. Almost certainly they did not as we understand it. But they observed, empirically, that people who drank from clean sources got sick less often. That cities with good drainage outlasted cities without it. That the practical details of water management were, quietly, matters of life and death. The engineering involved was extraordinary in its precision. Aqueducts had to maintain a constant, gentle downhill gradient, typically between 1 in 4,000 and 1 in 1,000 for their entire length. A slight miscalculation and the water stopped moving. A slightly steeper grade, and it moved too fast, eroding the channel. Roman engineers surveyed these gradients across distances of 50, 60, sometimes 90 kilometers. Through mountains they tunneled and valleys they bridged with tools that amounted to a straight rod, a plumb line, and a great deal of patient mathematics. The Aqua Claudia, completed in 52 CE, ran for 69 kilometers and descended just 56 meters in total elevation over that entire distance. The consistency of that slope, maintained by hand across decades of construction, is the kind of achievement that makes modern engineers quietly set down their coffee and stare at the wall for a moment. And then there's the Pont du Gard in southern France, technically part of the aqueduct that served the Roman city of Nemausus, modern Nîmes. A three-tiered stone bridge spanning 50 meters across the Gardon River, built around 50 CE without mortar on its upper tier. Just stone, shaped and fitted with precision so exact that gravity itself holds the structure together. It is still standing. If you visited tomorrow, and people do in their thousands, you could rest your hand on stones that a Roman mason cut and placed 2,000 years ago, before the fall of the Western Empire, before the medieval period, before the printing press, before almost everything we call modern history. One eccentric footnote worth knowing: Roman aqueducts were not entirely pure, despite their reputation. Lead pipes, used in parts of the distribution network, almost certainly leach some amount of lead into the water supply. Some historians have gone so far as to suggest that chronic low-level lead poisoning may have subtly affected the cognition of Rome's ruling classes over generations. Whether that explains any particular emperor's behavior is, perhaps, a question best left for a livelier hour of the day. For now, just listen to the sound of water moving through stone. Slow, steady, traveling toward you across 2,000 years. There's a phrase so old it has become invisible from overuse. All roads lead to Rome. You have heard it. You have probably said it. It has become the kind of expression people use without thinking, the way you say break a leg before performance, without picturing anyone's actual leg. It floats through the language, weightless, decorative. But it was once a literal description of the physical world. At the height of the Roman Empire, the road network stretched across approximately 400,000 kilometers of total routes, with around 80,500 kilometers of those being the famous stone-paved highways, the ones built to last, the ones that armies marched on and merchants measured their lives against. These roads connected Britain to Egypt, Spain to Mesopotamia, the cold northern forests of Germania to the sun-baked shores of North Africa. And they did, genuinely, all lead back to Rome. There was a golden milestone, the Miliarium Aureum, set up in the Roman Forum by the Emperor Augustus, for which all distances in the empire were officially measured. Every road, in theory, could be traced back to that single golden point. It was less a practical navigational tool and more a statement of worldview. Rome is the center. Rome is the origin. Everything radiates outward from here. Romans built roads for the same reason they built aqueducts, not out of romance, but out of necessity. An empire cannot function without communication. Armies cannot move without reliable surfaces. Grain cannot be transported. Taxes cannot be collected. Orders cannot be dispatched if every journey depends on the seasonal condition of a dirt track. When it rains, dirt becomes mud. When mud dries, it buckles and ruts. An empire built on dirt tracks is an empire perpetually one bad autumn away from logistical collapse. So Rome paved, and they paved with a sophistication that is genuinely startling when you examine the layers. A properly built Roman road, the Via Munita, the fortified way, was not simply stones laid on the ground. It was a construction project in 4 or 5 distinct layers. First, a trench was dug. Then it was filled with a deep layer of large stones or rubble, the statumen, to provide a stable foundation. Above that came a layer of smaller stones mixed with lime, the rudis. Above that, a layer of fine concrete or gravel, the nucleus. And on top of all of it, the carefully fitted paving stones, the summum dorsum, cut and laid with such precision that many required no mortar at all. The entire construction was typically cambered, slightly raised at the center, so that rainwater drained off to the sides rather than pooling on the surface. 2,000 years before modern highway engineering, Roman road builders had independently arrived at most of the same principles. The roads were also wide enough for two carts to pass each other comfortably, which sounds obvious but was not a universal feature of ancient infrastructure. Milestones were placed at regular intervals. Every Roman mile, roughly 1,480 meters, noting the distance to the nearest major city. Rest stations, the mansions, appeared along major routes at intervals calculated for a day's travel, offering water, fodder for horses, and basic accommodation. It was, in effect, the ancient world's interstate highway system, complete with rest stops. One well-known historical fact that tends to surprise people: Roman roads were so durably built that many remained the primary routes of travel in Europe well into the medieval period and beyond. The Fosseway in England, the Via Appia in Italy, the Via Domitia in France. These were not abandoned and replaced. They were simply used, continuously, for centuries. In some cases, right up until the modern era, when asphalt was laid directly on top of Roman foundations because the Roman engineers had already done the hard work of finding the best route. The Appian Way, the Regina Viarum, the Queen of Roads, was begun in 312 BCE, the same year as the first aqueduct by the same Appius Claudius Caecus, which suggests that man had an exceptionally productive year. It eventually ran over 560 kilometers from Rome to the heel of Italy's boot, and sections of its original paving stones are still walkable today. Here is the eccentric curiosity that sits at the edge of this story. Historians still debate whether Roman roads inadvertently contributed to the spread of epidemic disease across the empire. The same infrastructure that moved armies and grain with unprecedented efficiency also moved pathogens. The Antonine Plague of 165 CE and the Plague of Cyprian in 249 CE both spread with a speed that may have been partly enabled by Rome's magnificent road network. The road giveth, and the road taketh away. Historians also still argue about whether the standardized Roman road width, designed around the span of a two-horse cart, is the true ancient ancestor of modern railway gauge standards. The theory, beloved of internet history enthusiasts everywhere, traces a line from Roman axle widths to medieval cart ruts to early British railway measurements to the standard gauge still used on most of the world's railways today. Most serious historians treat this chain with considerable skepticism, but it refuses to entirely die, which perhaps says something about how much we want the Romans to be responsible for everything. What is certain, what no one disputes, is simpler and more profound. The Roman road network created the concept of reliable overland travel. It said for the first time that a person could set out from one point and expect to arrive at another on a predictable surface in a predictable time, that a letter sent would be a letter received, that a city and its distant province could function as parts of a single organism. That idea, the connected world, the place where distance is not an absolute barrier, is one of the foundational ideas of civilization as we know it. And it was paved, one careful stone at a time, by Roman engineers whose names we will never know. There is something quietly humbling about a material that gets stronger with age. Everything we know, everything in the modern, accelerating, disposable world follows the opposite logic. Things weaken, things wear, things require maintenance and replacement and eventual apology. The bridge needs repainting. The road needs resurfacing. The building needs its facade restored every generation or so, or begins to show its years in ways that make engineers nervous. Roman concrete does not follow this logic. Roman concrete, in certain conditions, actually strengthens over time. It grows denser. It becomes more resistant to cracking. Structures built with it 2,000 years ago are, in some measurable ways, more durable today than the day they were completed. Modern scientists only fully began to understand why in the 21st century, and when they finally did, it caused a small but genuine stir in the engineering world, the kind of quiet excitement that doesn't make headlines but travels very fast among people who think about materials for a living. But let us begin at the beginning. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, was not invented fully formed. It evolved over several centuries from rough early versions used in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE into the sophisticated hydraulic material that built the Pantheon's unreinforced dome and the harbor installations of Caesarea Maritima, structures that have sat in salt water or supported their own enormous weight for 2 millennia without significant failure. The key ingredient, the thing that made Roman concrete genuinely different from everything that came before and most of what came after, was a volcanic ash called pozzolana, named after the town of Pozzuoli near Naples, where large deposits were found. Pozzolana is a silica-rich ash that, when mixed with lime and seawater, undergoes a chemical reaction that produces an exceptionally stable binding compound. The Romans discovered this empirically, through observation and experiment, not through chemistry as we understand it, and they used it everywhere. They mixed it with lime. They added chunks of rubble, broken pottery, pieces of stone. They poured it into forms. And what set was not merely hard, but chemically active in a way that conventional concrete is not. Here is the discovery that startled modern scientists. Roman marine concrete, the kind used to build harbor walls and sea barriers, actually reacts with seawater over time. The salt water infiltrates microscopic cracks in the material and triggers the growth of interlocking mineral crystals, a compound called tobermarite, which effectively heals the cracks as they form. The concrete self-repairs, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, but measurably. Modern Portland cement concrete, the kind used in virtually every large construction project on Earth today, does not do this. It is strong at first and weakens over decades. Most modern concrete structures are designed with a functional lifespan of 50 to 100 years. Roman harbor structures have been sitting in the Mediterranean for 20 times that. Historians still argue about whether the Romans understood the exceptional properties of pozzolana concrete, or whether they simply knew, through accumulated practice, that this particular mixture worked better than others. There's a difference between knowing that something works and understanding why it works, and the Romans, for all their engineering genius, were not, in general, theoretical scientists. They were builders. They used what worked. The chemistry was invisible to them. What was not invisible was the result. The Pantheon in Rome, completed around 125 CE under the Emperor Hadrian, has an unreinforced concrete dome spanning 43.3 meters. It was the largest dome in the world for over 13 centuries. It has no steel reinforcement, no modern fasteners, no periodic maintenance interventions of any significance. It has survived earthquakes, the fall of an empire, the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, and the daily footfall of millions of tourists. It is still, structurally, entirely sound. For the eccentric footnote, and this one is genuinely strange, Roman builders sometimes added animal hair, blood, and even volcanic sand from specific regional deposits to their concrete mixtures, apparently having observed that certain batches performed better than others and attempting to replicate results they could not fully explain. There are Roman-era construction manuals like Vitruvius's De Architectura that specify ingredient ratios and mixing procedures with a precision that reads almost like a recipe, because that is essentially what it was. A recipe passed down through generations of builders, refined by observation, never fully understood but never abandoned because it simply stubbornly worked. The loss of Roman concrete knowledge after the fall of the Western Empire is one of history's more poignant technological regressions. Medieval builders, working without access to pozzolana deposits or the accumulated craft knowledge of Roman construction guilds, produced structures that were often technically inferior to what the Romans had achieved 500 years earlier. The knowledge did not disappear all at once. It faded slowly as the networks that carried it dissolved. It would take until the 18th century for engineers to rediscover hydraulic lime, until the 19th century for Portland cement to be developed, and until the 21st century for anyone to fully understand what made Roman marine concrete so quietly extraordinary. There is a lesson in there somewhere about the fragility of knowledge, about how civilizations can unknowingly carry genius and unknowingly lose it. But for now, let that thought settle gently. Let it rest. Like concrete, curing slowly in the dark, growing stronger with each passing hour. You are warm. You are safe. The weight of the day is setting around you like a material that will, in the morning, be stronger for having rested. Let your breath slow. The Romans built for permanence. Tonight, so can you. Let us talk about something nobody writes poems about. Nobody names their children after it. No great painter chose it as a subject. No philosopher opened a treatise with its praises. And yet, if you were to ask a public health historian, the kind of person who spends their career thinking carefully about what actually kept large numbers of human beings alive across the centuries, they would very likely tell you that it deserves more gratitude than almost anything else Rome ever built. We're talking about the sewer, specifically the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, one of the oldest and most consequential pieces of infrastructure in the history of human civilization, and almost certainly the least celebrated achievement in a civilization full of celebrated achievements. The Cloaca Maxima began, as so many great Roman projects did, with a problem that was both very large and very unpleasant. The area between Rome's famous Seven Hills was, in the city's earliest days, a low-lying marsh. A swamp, really. It flooded seasonally. It bred insects. It accumulated the kind of standing water that, in a warm climate, becomes a quiet factory of disease. The valley between the Capitoline and Palatine Hills, the area that would eventually become the Forum, the civic heart of the entire Roman world, was in its natural state a waterlogged, mosquito-rich bog that smelled precisely as bad as you are imagining. Someone had to drain it. Tradition attributes the Cloaca Maxima to the reign of Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, sometime in the 6th century BCE, which would make it older than the Republic itself, older than the consuls, older than almost every institution Romans considered foundational to their civilization. Before Rome had laws written on stone tablets, before it had elected officials, before it had any of the political machinery it would eventually export to the Western world, it had a drain. The sewer came first. The original construction was a large open channel, cut through the marshy ground to redirect water toward the Tiber. Over centuries, as the city grew and the Forum became the bustling center of Roman public life, the channel was covered, enlarged, and incorporated into a broader underground drainage network that gradually extended beneath much of the city's footprint. By the imperial period, the Cloaca Maxima had become an enormous vaulted tunnel, nearly 4 meters wide in its main channel, built of carefully fitted stone and later reinforced with Roman concrete, running from the upper city down to an outlet at the Tiber embankment, where it discharged into the river through an arched mouth that is still visible today. Still visible, and still functional. The Cloaca Maxima still drains Rome. After more than 2,500 years of continuous operation, the Great Drain remains a working part of the city's active drainage infrastructure. It has been repaired, reinforced, and connected to modern systems over the centuries. But the original channel still carries water toward the Tiber, as it has done since before Julius Caesar was born, before the Punic Wars, before Rome had any idea it would one day rule the known world. That is not a metaphor or a loose historical flourish. That is a literal verifiable fact. Now, let us be honest about what the Cloaca Maxima actually drained, because this is not a story that benefits from euphemism. It drains sewage, human waste, animal waste, the runoff from public latrines. The Farica, where Romans sat in companionable rows on stone seats with holes cut in them, over channels of running water that carried everything efficiently downhill and away. It drained the blood and refuse from the city's meat markets and fish stalls. It drained the overflow from the aqueduct system, the bathhouses, the public fountains. It drained the accumulated biological consequence of 1 million people living in close proximity to each other, eating and drinking and existing in the way that living things unavoidably do. And in doing so, it performed a function that modern epidemiology can measure with uncomfortable precision. It saved lives. Vast numbers of lives. Continuously. Generation after generation, year after unremarkable year. The diseases that killed the inhabitants of ancient cities most efficiently, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, are all diseases of fecal contamination. They travel through water that has been in contact with human waste. A city without drainage is a city where that contact is constant and inevitable, where the boundary between drinking water and sewage is a matter of proximity and rainfall rather than engineering. A city with drainage, with a system that reliably moves waste away from the places where people eat, drink, and sleep, breaks that chain imperfectly but meaningfully. Rome, with its sewers and its aqueducts working in concert, maintained that boundary with a consistency that was genuinely unusual in the ancient world, and the population numbers reflected. Rome grew to a size that no other Western city would match for over 1,000 years after its fall, and part of that growth was simply that fewer people died of waterborne illness than in comparable cities without equivalent infrastructure. Here is the well-known historical fact that tends to stop people mid-sentence. Rome's public latrines were unabashedly social spaces. Romans used them communally, without privacy partitions of any kind, often while carrying on perfectly ordinary conversations. There are records of business discussions conducted in latrines, of social visits paid, of gossip exchanged between neighbors who happen to find themselves sharing a stone bench with 12 holes cut in it above a channel of running water. The Roman attitude toward bodily functions was, to put it as gently as the subject allows, considerably less private than modern Western sensibilities are entirely comfortable contemplating. The eccentric curiosity attached to the Cloaca Maxima is this: the Romans personified it. There was a goddess of the sewer, Cloacina, her name derived from the Latin cluo, meaning to cleanse or purify, who was worshipped at a small shrine positioned near the drain's entrance in the forum. She was eventually syncretized with Venus herself, which is the kind of theological development that genuinely requires a quiet moment to absorb. The goddess of love and the goddess of the sewer were, in the Roman religious imagination, the same divine presence. Historians still argue about whether this reflects a genuine spiritual reverence for cleansing and civic purification, a practical acknowledgement that keeping a city sanitary was a sacred duty no less important than any other, or simply the wonderfully pragmatic Roman habit of assigning divine oversight to everything that mattered, regardless of how it presented aesthetically. Perhaps it was all three at once. What is not in dispute is the legacy that flows from this unglamorous achievement. Every city in the modern world with a functioning sewer system, which is to say, every city that does not regularly lose significant portions of its population to waterborne disease, is building on a concept that Rome demonstrated at scale and with engineering confidence before most of the world had thought to ask the underlying question. The question being, simply and essentially, where does it all go? Rome answered it, built it in stone, and then, with characteristic practicality, built a shrine. There is a phrase that has survived from ancient Rome with the same durability as its roads and its concrete, worn smooth by 2,000 years of repetition until it has become almost invisible. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The poet Juvenal coined it sometime around the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, and he meant it as a criticism, a lament, a sharp observation about a citizenry that had, in his view, traded genuine political engagement for free food and spectacular entertainment. Give the people bread and a good show, Juvenal suggested, and they will ask no uncomfortable questions about who holds power or how it is being used. It was meant to sting, and it did. It has been stinging continuously for nearly 2,000 years, deployed by political commentators in almost every era since as a shorthand for the manipulation of populations through comfort and distraction. But here is what that famous phrase tends to obscure. The bread was real. The bread was delivered. And for the people receiving it, the hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens who depended on the grain dole, the fermentatio, to feed themselves and their families, it was not a political manipulation. It was the difference between eating and not eating. It was survival. The Roman grain dole had its origins in the reforms of a tribune named Gaius Gracchus, who in 123 BCE established the principle that the Roman state had an obligation to sell grain to its citizens at a subsidized price. Over subsequent generations, that price dropped further. By the late Republic, the grain was free. By the imperial period, the dole had expanded to include not just grain, but in some periods, olive oil, wine, and eventually pork. At its height, the Roman grain dole served somewhere between 150,000 and 320,000 people in the city of Rome alone. Recipients, free male citizens who had registered for the dole, collected their monthly allocation at designated distribution points around the city. The logistics of moving, storing, and distributing that volume of grain across a city of 1 million people required a bureaucratic infrastructure of considerable sophistication. Rome built that infrastructure. It built massive warehouses, the Horia, along the Tiber, where grain transported from Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa was stored in conditions carefully managed for humidity and temperature. The Horia Galbae, one of the largest, covered an area of roughly 22,500 square meters and consisted of hundreds of individual storage rooms arranged around open courtyards. It was, in effect, a warehouse district, a logistics hub, an ancient supply chain, managed by state administrators whose job was to ensure that the city did not run out of bread. Because a city that runs out of bread does not stay quiet. The Romans understood this with a clarity that came from experience. Grain shortages triggered riots. Riots threatened stability. Stability was the foundation on which everything else, the roads, the aqueducts, the courts, the commerce, depended. The grain supply was not generosity. It was infrastructure of a different kind. Social infrastructure, the kind that keeps 1 million people from tearing the place apart. Alongside the grain dole, Rome developed a sophisticated public baking system. The city's pastrina, commercial bakeries, were regulated, inspected, and in some periods directly managed by state authorities. By the 4th century CE, Rome had somewhere in the region of 250 to 300 registered bakeries supplying the city's population. Bakers formed one of the most tightly regulated professional guilds in the empire, the Collegium Pistorum, whose members were eventually bound to the profession by law. Bakers' sons were required to become bakers themselves, which was perhaps less a career development program and more an acknowledgement that the bread supply was too important to be left to the uncertainties of personal ambition. Here is the well-known historical fact. The Roman annona, the state grain supply system, was the largest organized food distribution program the ancient world had ever seen and would remain unmatched in scale for many centuries after Rome's fall. At its operational peak, the annona managed the transport of roughly 150,000 to 400,000 tons of grain per year into the city, drawn from provinces as far away as Egypt, which Julius Caesar had once described as Rome's breadbasket, with a possessiveness that Egypt's inhabitants probably found uncomfortable. The eccentric curiosity in this story involves the bread itself. Roman bakers were skilled technicians, and the preserved bakeries of Pompeii, frozen in remarkable detail by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, show us exactly what their operations looked like. Archaeologists have found actual loaves of bread carbonized by the eruption, perfectly preserved in their pans, with the baker's stamp still pressed into the crust. Some of these loaves were stamped with the name of their maker, a form of branding that is simultaneously ancient and entirely familiar. One carbonized loaf from Pompeii, now housed in a museum in Naples, has been analyzed by food scientists who determined that it was made from a reasonably high-quality wheat flour, leavened, and baked at a controlled temperature. It would, apparently, have tasted recognizably like bread. Historians still argue about whether the Roman grain dole represented a genuine proto-welfare state, a government accepting structural responsibility for feeding its citizens, or simply a calculated political tool deployed by successive rulers to maintain urban stability. The honest answer is almost certainly that it was both simultaneously, that the Romans were practical enough to see no contradiction between a policy being genuinely useful and also being politically convenient. What matters across the long arc of history is what it established: the idea that a city owes its people food, that the state has a role in ensuring that its inhabitants do not starve, that the logistics of feeding a population are not merely a private concern, but a public responsibility. That idea, planted in Roman grain warehouses along the Tiber, is still growing. Close your eyes for a moment, or keep them half open, soft-focused, the way they get when the night has settled properly around you. And imagine being a soldier in the Roman army somewhere near the Rhine frontier around the year 100 CE. You have marched, by conservative estimate, thousands of kilometers in your military career. You have carried a pack weighing somewhere between 20 and 45 kilograms. You have built roads, dug ditches, constructed forts, and on certain occasions done the things soldiers are ultimately deployed to do. You are, in the language of modern sports medicine, an extreme endurance athlete operating without GPS, Gore-Tex, or any realistic expectation of a comfortable retirement. You get injured. This is not a question of if. It is a question of when and how badly. In most armies of the ancient world, at most points in history, what happened next was largely a matter of luck, personal resources, and the quality of whoever happened to be nearby. You were tended by a tent mate with limited knowledge, or a traveling doctor of variable competence, or nobody at all, depending on the circumstances. In the Roman army, something different happened. You were taken to the Valetudinarium. The Roman military hospital, the Valetudinarium, was one of the most significant medical innovations of the ancient world and one of the least discussed outside the narrow community of people who study Roman military history. It was a dedicated, purpose-built facility for the systematic treatment of sick and injured soldiers, designed from the ground up for the specific challenges of military medicine, and it represented a conceptual leap that would not be fully matched in Western medicine for well over 1,000 years. The design was standardized across the empire with the kind of regularity that Roman military planners loved. A typical Valetudinarium was arranged around a central courtyard, open to light and air, in recognition that patients recovered better with ventilation, which was an empirical observation long predating any understanding of germ theory. Surrounding the courtyard were rows of small individual rooms, each designed to hold one or two patients, opening onto a wide corridor. The individual rooms serve an isolation function. Patients with contagious conditions could be separated from those recovering from injuries. That was medically sophisticated even if the Romans would not have described it in those terms. Excavations of the Roman fort of Novisium in modern Germany and at Inchtuthil in Scotland have uncovered Valetudinaria whose floor plans reveal not just wards but specialized spaces. Rooms that appear to have functioned as operating areas, storage spaces for medical instruments and supplies, latrines positioned to minimize contamination of patient areas, and what appear to be staff quarters for the medical personnel, the Medici, who ran the facilities. Roman military medicine had genuine specialists. The medicus legionis was a trained physician attached to a legion, responsible for the overall medical care of several thousand men. Below him were capsarii, orderlies, essentially named for the capsa, the cylindrical box in which they carried bandages and basic medical supplies. There were also specialists in surgery, in ophthalmology, and in the treatment of the specific injuries that military service reliably produced: puncture wounds, fractures, infections, and a long-term joint damage that comes from carrying heavy weight over long distances on hard surfaces. The surgical instruments recovered from Roman military and civilian medical contexts are extraordinary. Scalpels, forceps, bone saws, catheters, specula, tools of a sophistication and precision that startled the historians who first cataloged them, because they so closely resemble the instruments used in surgery well into the modern era. A Roman surgical kit found at a site in Germany and dated to approximately 150 CE contains implements that a 19th century surgeon would have recognized and been able to use without significant adaptation. Here is the well-known historical fact. The Roman army's medical service was sufficiently organized and effective that Roman legions had dramatically lower rates of death from infected wounds than comparable military forces in later historical periods, including, by some estimates, European armies as recently as the 18th century. The combination of relatively clean facilities, systematic wound care, and the removal of injured men from the field to a dedicated treatment environment produced outcomes that were, for their time, genuinely impressive. The eccentric curiosity attached to Roman military medicine involves a painkiller. Roman surgeons used a preparation called mandragora, mandrake root, as a sedative and analgesic during surgical procedures, sometimes in combination with wine and opium poppy extracts. The mixture was administered orally before an operation and produced a state of reduced consciousness that, while not equivalent to modern general anesthesia, made surgery significantly more survivable by reducing the shock response and allowing surgeons to work more carefully. A Roman soldier going under the knife in a valetudinarium on the Rhine frontier in 100 CE was not being operated on while fully conscious and simply biting a leather strap, as popular imagination tends to assume. He was, in a modest but meaningful sense, being anesthetized. Historians still argue about how widely these sedative preparations were used and how standardized the recipes were across different parts of the empire. Ancient pharmacological texts vary considerably in their formulations, and the gap between what was written in medical manuals and what was actually available on a frontier posting in northern Britain was almost certainly significant. But the intention was there. The knowledge existed. The valetudinarium stood ready. And somewhere in its quiet rooms, by lamplight, a soldier rested and healed, tended by hands trained for precisely this purpose, in a building designed, from its foundation up, to give him the best possible chance of walking back out. That idea, the dedicated healing space, the systematic treatment, the trained specialist, the institution built around recovery, is the idea that eventually becomes the hospital. It started here. There is a particular quality of light that comes through old glass, not modern glass. Modern glass is too perfect, too flat, too optically neutral. Old glass, the kind made by hand, the kind with slight imperfections and variations in thickness, bends light in ways that are almost imperceptibly alive. It makes the light seem to breathe. It casts faint prismatic edges on stone floors. It turns a plain wall into something that moves slowly with the hour, changing as the sun moves, never quite the same from one moment to the next. If you have ever stood inside a very old building with its original windows intact, you may have noticed this without quite being able to name it. The Romans noticed it too. They were not the first people to cover an opening in a wall. Earlier civilizations used oiled animal skins, thin sheets of translucent stone like selenite or mica, wooden shutters, or simply nothing at all, an open hole that let in light and air together without distinguishing between them. These solutions worked after a fashion. They admitted light. They did not reliably admit light, while also excluding cold, wind, rain, and the general indifference of the outdoor world. Glass changed that equation. Glass had existed long before Rome. The Egyptians and Mesopotamians had been making glass objects for thousands of years, and by the 1st century BCE, glass blowing had been developed, likely in the region of modern Syria or Lebanon, producing vessels of remarkable beauty and variety. But the Romans took a material that had been primarily decorative and asked a different question of it. What if you made it flat? What if you made it large enough to fill a window opening? What if you let it do something more useful than hold wine? The earliest Roman window glass, appearing in the 1st century CE, was made by a process called cast glass. Molten glass poured onto a flat surface and smoothed with a tool while still soft, then allowed to cool. The results were not optically perfect by any modern standard. Early Roman window glass was often greenish or bluish, with bubbles and surface irregularities, sometimes translucent rather than fully transparent. But it admitted light while blocking wind. And in the cold, damp provinces of northern Europe, in Britain, in Gaul, in Germania, where Roman soldiers and administrators found themselves stationed far from the warm Mediterranean climate they considered civilized, that distinction mattered enormously. Excavations at Roman sites across Britain have revealed window glass fragments in military bathhouses, in private townhouses, in the heated rooms of villas whose hypocaust systems, which will come shortly, worked in combination with glass windows to create genuinely warm interior spaces in climates that would otherwise have made such comfort impossible. The glass window and the underfloor heating system were, in a sense, a matched pair. One held the cold out, the other pushed warmth up from below. Together, they created something that no previous Northern European architecture had reliably achieved. A room that was warm, dry, and filled with natural light simultaneously. A room, in other words, that felt like somewhere you might actually want to be. Here is the well-known historical fact. The Romans understood the greenhouse effect, at least empirically. They observed that a room with glass windows trapped solar heat more effectively than a room with open apertures, and they used this observation deliberately. Roman garden structures called specularia, essentially the world's first greenhouses, used thin sheets of a transparent mineral called lapis specularis, a variety of selenite, or occasionally glass, to create enclosed growing environments where plants could be cultivated year-round regardless of external temperature. The Emperor Tiberius, reportedly an enthusiastic consumer of cucumbers, is said to have relied on specularia to ensure a year-round supply, making him, arguably, the first person in recorded history to demand out-of-season vegetables, a habit that has since become universal. The eccentric curiosity here involves the surprising discovery, at several Roman archaeological sites, of window glass fragments with deliberate coloring, blue, green, amber, in context suggesting they were used not just for utility, but for aesthetic effect, for the pleasure of colored light moving through an interior space. The Romans were not simply solving a thermal problem. They were, as they so often were, also making something beautiful while they solved it. Historians still argue about how widely glass windows were used across different social classes and different regions of the empire. Glass was expensive. A wealthy Roman villa in the south of France might have glazed every window. A modest townhouse in Roman Britain might have had glass only in its bathhouse and heated reception room, with shutters or hides covering the rest. The archaeology suggests a technology in transition, present enough to be common, expensive enough to be selective. What glass windows did, beyond the practical, was subtler and more profound. They changed the relationship between inside and outside. Before glass, a room with open windows was a room that participated in the weather. Cold came in, sound came in, smells came in. The boundary between the inhabited interior and the natural exterior was permeable, negotiable, conditional. A room with glass windows was a room that could observe the world while remaining separate from it. You could watch rainfall without getting wet. You could see the garden in winter without feeling the cold. You could be inside and outside simultaneously, in a way that no previous architecture had quite managed. That shift, the interior as a controlled, insulated, observed space rather than a merely sheltered one, changed how people thought about domestic life, about privacy, about the difference between the world you lived in and the world you looked out at through a transparent barrier. It is such a common feature of every building you inhabit that it has become completely invisible, which is perhaps exactly what good glass should be. Imagine trying to find a specific passage in a very long piece of paper. Not a book, paper. One continuous piece wound around a wooden rod, which must be unrolled from one end and rolled onto another as you read, the way an old film reel moves through a projector. If you want to go back to something you read earlier, you roll backward. If you want to skip ahead, you roll forward. If you want to check 3 different passages in quick succession, cross-referencing, comparing, the way a scholar or a lawyer or a student naturally wants to work, you must unroll and re-roll with the patience of someone who has decided to make a virtue of inconvenience. This was the scroll, the volumen, the standard information storage technology of the ancient Mediterranean world for thousands of years, used by Egyptians and Greeks and Romans alike, carrying everything from Homer's epics to tax records to love poetry on its wound surface. It worked. Nobody is suggesting it did not work. But it had limitations that became more apparent as the volume of written material in the world expanded, as literacy spread, as the sheer quantity of things worth writing down increased beyond what any individual scroll could comfortably contain. And sometime in the 1st century CE, in Rome, in the quiet intersection of practical need and material experimentation, someone made a different choice. Instead of winding material around a rod, they stacked flat sheets and bound them along one edge. The codex was born. The word comes from the Latin codex, meaning the trunk of a tree, and the earliest codices were precisely that: humble, wooden tablets bound together with a ring or a cord, used for notes, accounts, drafts, the kind of temporary writing that did not merit the expense of a proper papyrus scroll. Roman schoolchildren used wax-coated wooden tablets in exactly this format, writing with a stylus and smoothing the wax to erase and reuse. Merchants used them for accounts. Soldiers used them for orders and rosters. Nobody initially thought of this as a revolutionary format. But then someone began making codices from parchment, dried, and prepared animal skin, instead of wax tablets. Parchment was more durable than papyrus, more flexible than wood, capable of accepting ink on both sides of a sheet, and available in large enough pieces to accommodate substantial amounts of text per page. A parchment codex could hold as much text as a very long scroll, in a fraction of the physical space, in a format that could be opened to any page directly. Any page, directly, without unrolling anything. The poet Martial, writing in Rome around 85 CE, wrote a series of short poems that amount to the ancient world's first book advertisements. He describes editions of his own work and of Virgil and Cicero, available in codex format, compact enough to hold in one hand on a journey. He recommends them with an enthusiasm that reads, across 2,000 years, almost like a product launch. The codex Martial suggested was better, more convenient, more useful. The future. He was right, but the future arrived slowly. For several centuries, scroll and codex existed side by side, with the scroll retaining prestige in literary and official contexts, while the codex gained ground in practical, religious, and legal ones. Early Christians adopted the codex format with particular enthusiasm. Scholars have noted that an overwhelming proportion of early Christian texts were produced as codices rather than scrolls, which may reflect the practical advantages of a format that allowed quick reference to specific passages, useful when debating scripture or constructing theological arguments. By the 4th century CE, the codex had largely displaced the scroll as the dominant format for extended written works across the Roman world and its successor cultures. The scroll did not disappear entirely. It persisted in certain formal and ceremonial contexts, and its ghost survives today in the roll diplomas handed to graduates at university ceremonies. But as a working technology for storing and accessing written knowledge, it had been superseded. Here is the well-known historical fact. The codex format is so well suited to human cognitive habits. Our ability to intuitively gauge our position within a bounded object, to flip forward and back, to dog-ear and annotate, to develop a physical relationship with a specific copy of a text, that has proven extraordinarily resistant to replacement even in the digital age. The e-reader, for all its convenience, mimics the codex. It shows pages. It has a beginning and an end. It allows you to jump to a specific location. The metaphors we use to describe digital reading, page, chapter, bookmark, are all borrowed from the physical codex. We did not replace the book. We made a glass version of it. The eccentric curiosity in this story involves the margins. Roman readers annotated their codices. They wrote notes in the margins, corrected perceived errors, recorded their reactions to the text, argued back at authors who could no longer respond. These marginal annotations, scholia, they were called, are sometimes the most valuable material on the page for modern scholars, because they tell us how real readers in antiquity responded to texts, what puzzled them, what delighted them, what they thought the author had got wrong. The impulse to write in the margins of a book, to talk back to the text, to leave traces of your reading in the object itself. That impulse is as Roman as the aqueduct. Historians still argue about whether the codex's widespread adoption was driven primarily by Christian communities, by Roman legal practice, by economic factors like parchment's relative cost advantage over imported Egyptian papyrus, or by simple ergonomic preference. The most careful scholars tend to conclude that it was all of these forces operating together, none of them sufficient alone, all of them pushing in the same direction at the same historical moment. What they produced together was the book, the object in which humanity has stored most of what it knows. The thing you might be holding right now, or resting on your nightstand, or listening to someone describe in a warm voice as the night deepens around you. It started in Rome, with someone who simply decided to stack the pages instead of rolling them. There's a moment in the depths of winter when warmth stops being a comfort and becomes something closer to a philosophy. Not the warmth of a blanket pulled up hastily against the cold. Not the quick warmth of a fire that requires constant tending, that asks something back from you in exchange for its heat. But the deep, even sourceless warmth of a room that is simply warm, floor to ceiling, corner to corner, without drama, without effort, without the cold ever quite finding its way back in. If you have ever stayed somewhere with radiant floor heating, you know the particular quality of this. The floor is warm beneath your feet. The air is warm without being stifling. There is no radiator to cluster around, no cold side of the room, no gradient between the fireplace end and the window end. The heat simply is distributed evenly and quietly, rising from below like something the building itself decided to do. The Romans invented this. They called it the hypocaust, from the Greek words for under and to burn. And by the 1st century BCE, it was appearing in Roman bathhouses, private villas, and eventually in the heated rooms of military installations in the coldest corners of the empire, bringing a form of thermal comfort to places like northern Britain and the Rhine frontier that their climates were manifestly not designed to provide. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. A raised floor was constructed on short columns of tile or stone. The pili, typically about 60 to 90 centimeters high, creating a hollow space beneath the living surface. A furnace, the prefernium, was built into an exterior wall, stoked from outside the room, so that the smoke and effort of fuel management happen away from the inhabited space. Hot gases and warm air from the furnace circulated through the underfloor cavity, heating the floor tiles from beneath. The warm air then rose through hollow clay pipes, tubuli, built into the walls, heating the room from floor to ceiling before escaping through vents near the roof. The result was a room heated from 3 sides simultaneously: floor, walls, and the warm air rising between them. A Roman bathhouse heated by hypocaust could maintain its caldarium, its hot room, at temperatures comparable to a modern sauna. But unlike a sauna, which uses concentrated radiant heat from a single source, the hypocaust distributed that heat through the entire fabric of the building. The floor tiles in the hottest rooms of Roman baths were sometimes too hot to walk on barefoot, which is why we have records of bathers wearing wooden sandals, balnear solia, to protect their feet while moving between pools. The system required skilled management. A trained slave, or freedman called the fornicator, was responsible for maintaining the furnace at the correct temperature, feeding fuel at the right rate to sustain the heat without overloading the system or allowing it to cool. It was, in effect, a job that required the same kind of patient attention and technical judgment that modern building services engineers apply to heating system management. The same problem solved 2,000 years apart by people whose tools were different, but whose challenge was identical. Here is the well-known historical fact. The hypocaust system was used not just for comfort, but for health management. Roman physicians recommended specific sequences of heated rooms, moving from warm to hot to cold and back, as therapeutic interventions for a variety of conditions. The Roman bath, with its tepidarium, caldarium, and frigidarium, was a structured thermal experience prescribed by doctors as well as enjoyed for pleasure. The idea that controlled heat exposure has medical benefits, an idea that underpins modern sauna culture, hydrotherapy, and certain physiotherapy practices, was being systematically applied in Roman bath complexes across the empire 2 millennia ago. The eccentric curiosity attached to the hypocaust involves a problem its inventors did not fully anticipate. Carbon monoxide. The hot gases circulating beneath Roman floors and through wall pipes included combustion byproducts from the furnace fuel: wood, charcoal, dried vegetation. If the system developed cracks or faults in its ceiling, these gases could infiltrate the living space. Roman medical writers noted, without always understanding the cause, that certain kinds of heated rooms produced symptoms, headaches, dizziness, weakness, that we now recognize as the early signs of carbon monoxide poisoning. The Romans knew something was wrong. They did not know what. They sometimes attributed the symptoms to the spiritual qualities of particular rooms or to the malign influence of bad air, the mala aria, a concept that, with slightly different application, would later give its name to an entirely different disease. What they had, in fact, was a ventilation problem in an underfloor heating system, a problem that modern building codes solve with flue requirements and carbon monoxide detectors. 2,000 years later, same problem. Different diagnostic tools. Historians still argue about how widely the hypocaust was used outside the specific context of bathhouses and wealthy private villas. The system required skilled construction, ongoing maintenance, and a reliable fuel supply, none of which were available everywhere across the empire. A legionary fort in Scotland might have a hypocaust in its bathhouse, but not in its barracks. A middling Roman townhouse in southern Gaul might have a single heated room for winter use and rely on portable braziers, faculae, for the rest of the building. But even limited availability represents a remarkable achievement. That a room in northern Britain, in the 2nd century CE, could be heated from beneath by a system elegant enough that modern engineers recognize it as a direct conceptual ancestor of radiant floor heating. That fact should perhaps pause you for a moment. Let's settle. Feel whatever warmth surrounds you now. The blanket, the bed, the room the day has left behind, and know that someone 2,000 years ago also found a way to keep the cold outside where it belonged. The floor was warm, the night was long, and the fire burned quietly beneath, invisible, patient, faithful. Look at today's date. Not the time, the date. The month, the number of the day, the year. The particular position this moment occupies in the long, continuous, numbered sequence of days that humanity has been maintaining, with varying degrees of accuracy, since we first decided that time was something worth tracking. That date, the way it is structured, The way the year is divided, the lengths of the months, the placement of the leap year, the sequence of names for January through December, is a Roman document. Specifically, it is the document of one man's intervention in one of the most consequential administrative crises of the ancient world, carried out with the help of an Egyptian astronomer and the full political authority of the most powerful individual Rome had ever produced. The man was Julius Caesar. The year of the intervention was 46 BCE, and the problem he was solving was this. The Roman calendar had become so catastrophically misaligned with the actual solar year that the month of March, which was supposed to correspond to the spring equinox, the agricultural and religious anchor of the Roman year, was arriving in what was, astronomically speaking, the middle of winter. The Romans had been using a lunar calendar, one based on the cycles of the moon rather than the movement of the earth around the sun, with periodic adjustments made by adding extra months when the drift became too noticeable. These adjustments were supposed to be managed by the pontifices, the priestly college responsible for maintaining the calendar. But the pontifices had been inserting and omitting intercalary months for political reasons, lengthening years to extend the terms of favored officials, shortening them to hasten the removal of others, until the calendar had accumulated months of error and bore almost no relationship to the seasons it was supposed to reflect. By 46 BCE, the civic calendar and the solar year were approximately 90 days apart. Spring was, on paper, happening in what the sun considered winter. This was not merely inconvenient. In an agricultural society where planting dates, harvest festivals, religious observances, and civic ceremonies were all tied to the calendar, a 90-day misalignment was a genuine crisis of coordination. Things happened at the wrong time. Festivals fell in the wrong season. The entire civic and agricultural rhythm of the Roman world was playing a song in the wrong key. Caesar fixed it with characteristic decisiveness. Working with an Alexandrian astronomer named Sosigenes, he devised a new calendar based on the solar year rather than the lunar cycle, with a year length of 365 days divided into 12 months of varying length, and a leap year of 366 days inserted every 4 years to account for the fact that the solar year is approximately 365.25 days long and accumulates a full extra day every 4 years. To correct the accumulated error of decades, Caesar declared that 46 BCE would have 445 days, inserting the extra days needed to bring the calendar back into alignment with the sun. Roman writers called it the Annus Confusionis, the year of confusion. Caesar presumably called it necessary. The Julian calendar, which took effect on January 1st, 45 BCE, was a masterpiece of practical astronomy translated into civic administration. It was accurate enough, close enough to the true solar year, that it served Western civilization as its primary time-keeping framework for over 16 centuries. 16 centuries. Here is the well-known historical fact. The Julian calendar had one small problem that took those 16 centuries to become significant. The solar year is not exactly 365.25 days long. It is approximately 365.2422 days, fractionally shorter. The difference is tiny, about 11 minutes per year. But 11 minutes per year, accumulated over 16 centuries, adds up to roughly 10 days of drift. By the 16th century, the calendar was again misaligned with the solar year, and the spring equinox, important to Christian churches for calculating the date of Easter, was arriving 10 days earlier than the calendar said it should. Pope Gregory XIII, in 1582, commissioned a correction. The Gregorian calendar adjusted the leap year rule slightly. Century years would only be leap years if divisible by 400, and deleted 10 days from October 1582 to correct the accumulated drift. The result was the Gregorian calendar that most of the world now uses. But the Gregorian calendar is a correction of the Julian calendar. It is built on Caesar's foundation. The month names are Caesar's. The 12-month structure is Caesar's. The leap year principle is Caesar's. Gregory tidied the mathematics. Caesar built the house. The eccentric curiosity in this story involves the month of July itself. It was named, during Caesar's lifetime or shortly after, in his honor. Iulius, July, making Caesar the first living human being to have a month of the calendar named after him. August followed, named for his successor and adopted son Augustus, because if Caesar got a month, Augustus was not going to be left out. July and August, 2 consecutive summer months, named for the man who restructured time and for the man who inherited his empire. Every time you write a date in summer, you are, in a small and entirely unconscious way, acknowledging 2 Romans who have been dead for 2,000 years. Historians still argue about how much of the Julian calendar reform was genuinely Caesar's intellectual contribution and how much should be credited to Sosigenes, the Alexandrian astronomer whose name appears in ancient sources but whose own writings have not survived. The honest answer is that we do not know the precise division of intellectual labor and may never know. What we know is that Caesar had the political will to implement the reform, the access to the best astronomical knowledge available, and the authority to make it stick. Time, as we measure it, bends back toward that moment. Every morning when you check the date, every appointment you make, every birthday you remember, every deadline you meet or miss, you're operating inside a framework that a Roman general and an Egyptian astronomer assembled together in a room we cannot locate in a year that had 445 days. The calendar is a Roman road through time, and you have been walking it without noticing every day of your life. There is something deeply human about wanting to know what happened yesterday. Not the grand sweep of history, not the long, slow movements of empires and ideas that we discuss on nights like this one, but yesterday, last week, the thing that occurred in the forum this morning while you were occupied elsewhere, the vote that was taken, the fire that broke out, the official who said something remarkable in public, the gladiatorial results that everyone is talking about, the decree that affects your business, your neighborhood, your life. The appetite for current information, for news, in the most straightforward sense of that word, is not a modern invention. It is not a product of the printing press or the telegraph or the 24-hour news cycle. It is as old as the first community large enough that you could not personally witness everything that happened within it. Rome, by the 1st century BCE, was very much that community. A city of perhaps 1 million people, spread across 7 hills, buzzing with political activity, commercial transaction, legal proceeding, military news from distant frontiers, and the ceaseless social churn of an enormously complex urban society. A city where what happened in the Senate could affect the price of grain within days. Where a military appointment announced in the forum could reshape fortunes across the empire. Where information was power, and the distribution of information was a political act. Julius Caesar, and it is Caesar again, as it was with the calendar, because certain individuals occupy outsized positions in the history of practical innovation, understood this with particular clarity. In 59 BCE, during his consulship, Caesar ordered the establishment of the Acta Diurna, the daily acts, the daily record, Rome's official gazette. The Acta Diurna was a public document, inscribed on wooden boards or stone tablets, and posted in prominent public locations across the city, particularly in the Forum, that recorded the official business and notable events of each day, Senate proceedings and decisions, the outcomes of significant legal cases, military dispatches from the frontiers, the results of public games, births and deaths in notable families, civic announcements, official appointments, and resignations. It was, in the most essential sense, a newspaper, not a newspaper as we would recognize it. There was no editorial voice, no commentary, no investigations, no opinion column, and certainly no crossword puzzle. It was a record rather than an analysis, a bulletin board rather than a journal. But it performed the fundamental function that all journalism performs at its most basic. It told people who had not been present what had occurred in their city on a given day. and it was public, posted in a place where anyone who could read. And in Rome, literacy rates were meaningfully higher than in most of the ancient world, could access it without payment, without permission, without the need to know the right people or be present at the right moment. The Acta Diurna ran, in some form, for several centuries. Copies were made and distributed to other cities across the empire. Wealthy Romans in their provincial villas, military commanders on distant postings, governors managing far-flung territories, all received transcribed copies of the Roman Gazette, sometimes weeks old by the time they arrived, but carrying with them the shape of events at the center of the world. Cicero, writing from his estates in the country, mentions receiving the Acta in his letters, sometimes gratefully, sometimes with the exasperation of a man who finds the official record incomplete and wishes someone would tell him what was really going on. He writes to his friend Atticus in Rome asking for more detail than the Gazette provides, for the context and the gossip that official records never capture. That frustration, the gap between the official version and the full story, and the desire for someone to bridge it, is one of the oldest tensions in the history of communication. Alongside the Acta Diurna, Rome developed a parallel tradition of public writing that is perhaps even more democratic in its origins. The walls. Roman cities were covered in writing. Not the formal inscriptions on temples and monuments, though those existed everywhere, but informal, spontaneous, densely layered text written directly on plastered walls by ordinary people with pieces of charcoal or scratched with sharp implements. The preserved walls of Pompeii carry thousands of these inscriptions: election endorsements, business advertisements, declarations of affection, insults directed at neighbors, announcements of upcoming games, lists of debts, records of transactions, and a remarkable quantity of observations about public figures that would not pass any modern editorial standard. These wall writings, graffiti, from the Latin graphio, to scratch, were a genuinely popular medium. They were written by people who were not officials, not scribes, not members of any professional information class. They were written by bakers and sailors and tavern keepers, and people who simply had something to say and a wall convenient enough to say it on. Here is the well-known historical fact. Pompeii's walls preserve the most extensive collection of ancient and formal writing anywhere in the world, with over 11,000 individual inscriptions cataloged and studied. Among them are what appear to be professionally painted electoral endorsements, ancient campaign posters, essentially, alongside handwritten personal messages that feel startlingly immediate across 2,000 years. One inscription reads, translated roughly, that a man named Gaius Plumidius Dipylus was here on a specific date. A name, a place, a date, the most basic assertion of existence a person can make. The eccentric curiosity in the Acta Diurna's story involves its disappearance. Unlike the roads and the concrete and the aqueducts, the Acta Diurna left no physical remains. No original copy has ever been found. What we know of it comes entirely from references in other texts, from Cicero's letters, from Suetonius, from later historians who mention in passing. The actual content of Rome's daily gazette is almost entirely lost, which is a particular irony for a document whose entire purpose was the preservation and distribution of current information. Historians still argue about how official and how comprehensive the Acta Diurna actually was, whether it represented a genuine attempt at public transparency or simply a curated official narrative, whether its content was selected to inform or to manage, whether Caesar's motivation in establishing it was genuinely civic or primarily political. The answer, once again, is almost certainly both. The idea he planted, however, grew well past his intentions. The idea that a city's inhabitants have a right to know what their government is doing, that public events should be publicly recorded, that information about the exercise of power belongs, in some meaningful sense, to the people over whom that power is exercised. That idea, radical in 59 BCE, foundational to every free press that has existed since. was scratched onto a wooden board and posted in the Roman Forum on an ordinary morning 2,000 years ago. And the wall it stood against is still standing. You have traveled a long way tonight. Not in miles. You have not moved at all. Most likely. You are exactly where you were when we began, in whatever warm and quiet place you arranged for yourself when the day finally released you. The pillow is the same. The blanket has not changed. The room around you is the same room it was an hour ago. And yet you have walked Roman roads and stood beside Roman springs. You have watched concrete cure in Mediterranean harbors and felt warm air rise through the floors of heated rooms on cold northern mornings. You have read the first newspaper posted in a Roman forum and turned the pages of the first book bound along its spine. You have lived for a little while inside the practical imagination of civilization that built for permanence and then, like all civilizations, did not last. Rome fell. That is the part everyone knows. The part that gets the dramatic treatment. The barbarian kings, the sacked city, the long, slow unraveling of institutions that had seemed, from inside them, like permanent features of the world. In 476 C, the last Western Roman emperor, a young man with the melancholy distinction of being named Romulus, the same name as Rome's legendary founder, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, and the Western Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. It was, as endings go, quieter than the drama of the preceding centuries might have suggested. And yet, the roads did not immediately stop being roads. The aqueducts did not immediately stop carrying water. The concrete did not begin to dissolve. The calendar kept its months in the order Caesar had assigned them. The codex kept its pages bound along the left edge. The sewer kept draining toward the Tiber. The idea of the hospital, of the public record, of the heated room, of the glass window, these things did not fall with the empire that had made them. They persisted. They moved through the medieval period like seeds carried in the fabric of a traveler's cloak. Some of them dormant for centuries, some of them continuously cultivated in monasteries and Islamic scholarly centers and Byzantine institutions that kept the flame of Roman knowledge alive when the Western political structure that had generated it was gone. The aqueduct principle traveled through medieval Islamic engineering and eventually back into European hydraulics. Roman road alignments were followed by medieval car tracks, and then by early modern highways, and then by the routes of railways and motorways that still follow the same topographical logic the Roman surveyors identified 2,000 years ago. Roman law, transmitted through the Justinianic codification of the 6th century, became the foundation of legal systems across continental Europe, Latin America, and much of the world beyond. And the concrete is still standing. Tonight, in the Mediterranean, Roman harbor walls that have been underwater for 2,000 years are still there. Still intact. Still, in some measured sense, still curing. The slow mineral chemistry of pozzolanic concrete continuing its patient work in the dark and cold at the bottom of the sea, building strength in silence, indifferent to the centuries passing above. There is something in that image worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that the most durable things are often the quietest ones. That the inventions which truly changed the world were rarely the spectacular ones. Rarely the triumphal arches and the marble emperors and the armies that crossed rivers on bridges of boats. They were the pipes, the drains, the flat pages bound along one edge, the volcanic ash mixed with lime in the right proportion, the channel cut into the hill at a gentle and precise gradient, carrying clean water downhill through the dark toward a city that needed it. These are not the things that get statues, but they're the things that kept people alive. And keeping people alive, it turns out, is how a civilization builds something that lasts longer than itself. You carry Rome with you, not consciously, not in a way that requires any particular historical awareness or reverence. You carry it the way you carry the language you think in, the way you carry the habits of mind that your education gave you without ever explicitly announcing itself. You carry it in the date you write at the top of a letter in the book you set on your nightstand, in the warm floor beneath your feet on a cold morning, in the clean water that arrives when you turn a handle, in the road that takes you where you need to go, in the building that keeps the weather outside where it belongs. All of this is Rome. All of this is the quiet, practical, unglamorous genius of people who looked at the world as it was and asked, consistently and with extraordinary patience, how it might be made to work a little better, how the water might be moved, how the road might be laid, how the sick might be healed, how the cold might be kept outside, how the knowledge might be preserved, how the people might be fed, how the days might be counted, how the news might be shared. These questions are still being asked. They will always be asked. And somewhere in the long chain of answers, somewhere in the plumbing and the roads and the laws and the books and the hospitals and the calendars and the newspapers of the modern world, the Roman answer is still present, still working, still carrying its small portion of the weight that keeps civilization upright. Let that thought settle over you now like something warm, like heat rising slowly through an old stone floor. You are lying in the long shadow of people who built for you without knowing your name. They built the roads so that you could be reached. They built the pipes so that you could drink. They built the books so that you could know. And tonight, in this quiet hour, at whatever local time you find yourself listening from wherever in the world you're resting, you are exactly where all those roads were always leading. Here, safe, warm, known. And so we arrive, at last, at the end of tonight's road. It has been a long one, as Roman roads tend to be, stretching back through 25 centuries of quiet ingenuity, through the lives of engineers and bakers and doctors and scribes whose names we will mostly never know, who got up in the morning and solved problems and went to sleep again without any particular expectation that what they had done would still be in use 2,000 years later. They did not build for posterity. They built because the water needed to move and the road needed to be laid, and the sick person in the next room needed somewhere clean and quiet to recover. They built because problems in any era simply asked to be solved. And here, now, in the deepest part of the night, in whatever corner of the world you have carried tonight's journey to, there is nothing left to solve, nothing that needs doing, nothing that asks anything of you at all. The water is flowing somewhere beneath the city, through pipes that follow principles Rome established. The road outside is waiting, patient and still, for morning. The building around you is holding the night at bay with walls and windows that have their oldest ancestors in Roman stone and Roman glass. Everything is in order. Everything has been arranged by 2,000 years of accumulated human ingenuity for your comfort and safety and rest. All you have to do is let the day go. Let it drift. Let follow the aqueduct downhill in the dark, carrying everything it carried all the way to the river. And sleep, slowly, warmly. The empire is resting. And so now are you. Sweet dreams.